I had a few notes, mostly on the language of creation, but I have more like, I wouldn't say long term, but just kind of more consolidated memory of McGilchrist and Vervaeke's work, of course, since I've spent more time on theirs. Um, but yeah, what did you want to focus on?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think the first thing that comes to mind is some of the tension between and the dialogues that Jean Vervaeke and Jonathan Pageau have been having with one another. Um, and I guess sort of the tension between Vervaeke's um, sort of non-theistic naturalism and Jonathan Pageau's symbolic traditionalism, perhaps, might be a way of framing those, and how to sort of approach those two sort of dialectically, I guess, and kind of integrate understandings from a bunch of other different things that we've talked about, McGilchrist's work, some of the spiritual stuff that we've been reading in our reading groups. I'm just curious what your thoughts are about a lot of that stuff and how you think about how those are connected to one another, because I'm weighing them in my mind and I'm certainly not at any firm conclusions. Um, but they're definitely relevant to, I think, a lot of the um, personal sort of like existential and spiritual concerns that I have, and the culture at large. I have a deep affinity and sympathy with the symbolic sort of traditionalist worldview, um, but I also find myself at a loss for how to navigate my own spiritual life within that worldview. And I feel somewhat similarly for Vervaeke's worldview, which I also have a deep affinity and sympathy for. And that's kind of where I'm at. So I guess in that sense, I'm somewhat spiritually homeless um, at the current moment. I don't have a tradition to which I belong, and I don't uh, see a way of going back to the tradition I was raised in. And I wonder about the utility of going into a new tradition. Um,
Hmm.
so I think in terms of my own personal sort of like stuff, that's kind of where I'm at. And I'm curious how you think about the connection between those two things. And I figure we could kind of start there and then just let the conversation take us where it wants to take us.
Yeah, it's extremely dense topic. These two kind of perspectives. Well, I always am looking forward to when they do meet. Like those two, Vervaeke and Pageau, if they were talking, that's like by far the number one thing I would just instantly want to watch because I feel like that's the real kind of spark or tension point between at least all the stuff I'm following. I almost see them, and I agree with basically everything you said. By the way, I find myself in a very similar position, for sure, and I feel like in some ways I see them as the two kind of more um, more coherent and richer. Uh, they're not the inheritors, but in terms of publicity, inheritors of like the thing Jordan Peterson started, and they're kind of like going in two different directions, or he's kind of between them in some ways. But I feel like they actually have a more like a sharper argument for what is best for the culture, and yet they're both further away from him in some sense. And then someone like Paul Vanderklay is kind of trying to mediate between them, and he's kind of like a smaller presence and doesn't really have like a strong new idea in some sense. But I appreciate his flexibility and like listening to all sides. Um, yeah, I would say I think the lack of narrative in John's work, uh, at least for it seems like up until now for most people, it seems like it would be an issue. I think that Paul said for the scalability for most people to like easily join in the communities of practice and so on. Um, and I also instinctually have a strong aversion to basically to dogma very much. And so any kind of like what he always says, any final solution or final answer that narratives can have the danger of providing ammunition for people with that more fundamentalist personality, which I think it's just like some people just have that genetically. I feel like, and if they don't have some kind of framework to mediate that, they'll just kind of like latch on to whatever framework there is, which I think you can see in all the various culture wars going on right now. Um, but I'm very attracted to the idea of like an open-ended telos, or like a narrative that allows itself to evolve in some sense. Um, so I feel like, yeah, Pageau is basically, I don't know if you're familiar with Pierre Sig's work, the guy who wrote the Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance.
Mhm.
Um, and Sevilla King does a lot of good videos on his stuff, and she's talked to both of them, where there's this metaphor of the, was it the ratchet and the lever, and the ratchet is like static quality, like retaining the patterns that have worked for, well, not just humans, but going up the tree of matter and life and mind and culture that have worked so far. And then the lever as kind of like looking for new dynamic patterns that are more contextually adaptive for the current environment. And you could kind of see that as like the right and the left respectively. And I think also like Pageau and Vervaeke to some extent, but I definitely feel like there's got to be more sense than just one or the other for sure.
Yeah, it also made me think of the chaos order, especially the way Peterson talks about it, kind of finding this dynamic balance, between um, sort of rigidity and looseness, right? Where you need a little bit of, solidity in your stance, but you also need, enough dynamism so that you can roll with the waves as they come, so to speak. No, I'm with you as far as all of that stuff is concerned. I think one of the things that stood out to me in the discussion that I think Jonathan Pageau and Vervaeke had was Rebel Wisdom facilitated it. It was this dialogue.
Mm.
Vervaeke used this example I thought was really insightful, and it was sort of the idea of kind of like almost like the MMA of wisdom traditions.
Yeah, that was the key takeaway I'm always thinking about from that talk.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And Pageau's response.
And his response, because my recollection was that Pageau more or less said, yeah, that's okay as long as there are like actual masters out there to be authority figures to say like, okay, these are how the practices should be done versus how they should not be done, right? Because, and Vervaeke is aware of this, right? Because he always is seeking the sort of autodidactism of,
Yeah.
modern era, where it's like people are just kind of cobbling practices together. And when you're in that situation, confirmation bias is super easy, right? It's like, I'm doing all these practices, I'm neglecting the practices that are hard, which are the ones that will actually make me grow. And I'm doing the practices that are easy, which are just the ones that aren't really adding to my development. And so then you can kind of like delude yourself into thinking you're becoming more spiritual than you really are in some sense. I see that very frequently among a large group of friends that I have that have sort of gone down that route. And I kind of see the tension on both sides, because I also have a lot of friends that are more fundamentalist, and I can also see some of the challenges associated with that too. And so kind of learning how to navigate that in our current world is difficult, I think, because the world is changing so quickly. And the rate at which cultural evolution, I think, is happening is so much greater than it ever has been at any time, that I'm not sure the traditionalist perspective that Pageau is putting forward is as relevant as it might have been in a previous time period.
Yeah.
And that's where I start to get concerned. And I think, how do I phrase this? I guess the question is, if we take Vervaeke's idea of these as like sort of like wisdom MMA type practices, where we kind of integrate, the people who integrate practices from a variety of traditions tend to develop in wisdom more than people who only cling to one tradition. We take that as an empirical claim that's true. What does it look like to implement that in a way that is helpful? And that's the real question, I think, that I don't know if either Vervaeke or Pageau necessarily have a great answer for. But I think a lot of people are working on. And so I don't know. I guess, in terms of the context of, I mean, it's kind of like there's two levels at which you can think about this. So you can think about it in terms of your own personal life, like what it is that you decide to do in terms of like your own spiritual practice, and then what's good for the culture. And I think those are sometimes at odds, sometimes in conjunction with one another. Ideally, they'd be in conjunction with one another. But I I'm starting to feel increasingly that for a lot of people, those are in conjunction, or like not in conjunction with one another, but those are at odds with one another. And that's problematic. I don't know. Those are just some thoughts.
Yeah, what would be an example of that last bit where they're in conflict for someone
Yeah, I think
that you've
like,
seen?
well, one example is it might be better for the culture if more people were religious or evolved in religious communities that were scalable in the way that traditional religious communities are. But in some ways, that might be bad for certain individuals. I think individuals with more open temperaments, who are less predisposed to dogma, who are less predisposed to like thinking in narrow religious ways, or perhaps that are marginalized by their religious groups, which is like a point that's very salient to me. I was raised in the Mormon church, and like, you know, it's great if you're like a straight white male, but but it's not so great, you know. I mean, relatively speaking, obviously everybody has different experiences, but you know, there's a large group of people outside of that group that tend to be somewhat marginalized by that larger community, right? And that every community of faith has that dynamic to some degree. Some are better than others about managing that. And so, you know, it might be better for the culture for people to sort of manage those dynamics in a healthy way in the context of traditional religions. But it might not be the right choice for specific individuals.
Yes.
And like, you know, I think about one of the things in the LDS church is a good example is like, you know, LGBT individuals, for example, are often sort of like ostracized by that religious tradition. And I know a lot of LGBT individuals who left the church, and they had to leave the church because it was the only thing they could do for their like psychological health. Like they were not going to be healthy inside of that religious tradition, so they went elsewhere. And I have no criticisms of that at all whatsoever. I'm like, yeah, make the right decision for yourself. And so I think it's becoming increasingly the case that situation is becoming more and more true for more people, because of the way in which our culture is changing at a rate at which religious culture is not changing. And so then there's this increasing you know, group of people who don't feel like they can identify with a traditional religion or all the benefits that a community of sacred practice gives to those people, and then are left wondering what to do in its absence, and some finding better or worse solutions in the absence of
Yeah.
their religious cultures.
Yeah, I feel like that thing that would help people mediate different practices to make sure they're not just falling into kind of like a consumerist spirituality with easy ones is I think what like Jordan Hall was talking about as a meta psychotechnology to organize all the various psychotechnologies, which I think is traditionally what a religious framework, including narrative, would help with. But because those are, you know, they update very slowly. I mean, that's part of their benefit, but because, like you said, the culture is changing so fast, and I feel like those that kind of try to embody a traditional frame of a given religion, and just kind of stay there and refuse to jump around. Like I think Pageau is the best example of doing that, and like the best manifestation of that, where like at least from my perspective it seems like his take on Orthodox Christianity seems, even though it is quite old, seems quite well, yeah, like rich and stable, but also it's not seemingly able to update with new knowledge. Like I remember there was a Q&A he was doing where someone asked, like, are you aware the official position in the Orthodox Church is that the earth is 7,500 years old, and he kind of had to state it in such a way that, like, yeah, that's about right for, like, he's talking about it in terms of narrative and history and civilization, but the awkwardness with which presumably he did this, you know, partially because he didn't want to be excommunicated or something, like that kind of um out outdated literalism, which is far worse in like Protestant fundamentalist cultures that I was kind of adjacent to growing up. Those I don't see those having much of a healthy chance going into the future. But even that kind of thing for Pageau, it just seems like I just have a hard time seeing that scale back up to like a population of multiple Western nations the way it was at the height of medieval era, which he often uses as the metric for when everything was the best, without significant updates, which is obviously going to be a messy process, which traditionalism is kind of inherently I don't know about opposed to, but yeah, it doesn't occur easily. And I feel like what John was trying to do with the religion that's not a religion was not so much what I think Pageau was concerned about. I think he only watched he and Jordan Hall's first video on it, where they were trying to create a new religion. But I think at least its most likely benefit, if it did become more popular, is I would hope a kind of grammar for actual interfaith dialogue, where you get to the phenomenology underlying the different narrative patterns and symbols common to human experience generally, at least to some degree, using cognitive science and so on, rather than a replacement. And I think that could be helpful potentially. Like that's kind of the low bar for what I think it could reasonably do if it became popular enough, rather than a replacement religion, which is obviously far more ambitious, and I don't think was his intention originally.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I got a similar impression. I only watched the first discussion that they had, like Vervaeke and Jordan Hall. I didn't get a chance to watch the second one, so I don't know what else they went into. But even from the first one, I sort of got the impression that they were, thinking about a way to, so to speak, get as many of the benefits of traditional religion as possible with as few as the costs.
Yeah.
Context of the modern sort of culture, rather than like to actually replace it in a substantial way. And I think we're at a place where our culture is so fragmented that it wouldn't even make sense to talk about a replacement for religion as a whole, right? Because there's just so many different traditions, so many interpretations of those traditions. There's not one thing that would meaningfully replace them. It's more like a set of different things. In the case of Vervaeke's terminology, a set of psychotechnologies that are like orchestrated together into communities of practice.
Yeah, the ecologies of practice. Yeah.
Yeah. I like the idea of like wisdom institutions.
Yes.
I'm hoping, I know there are people that are involved in that work. Heck, for a good period of time, I was thinking about doing something like that at my university, the one I'm at currently, and then COVID hit, and I was like, well, maybe I'll do something else for a while. But I'm definitely deeply interested in and motivated by that idea. And I think if there were a version of that was sort of scaled up in a way that, in most places you could find one of these like wisdom communities, so to speak. I think for me that would probably end up like taking the role of like that church used to play in my life.
Yeah.
But I don't think we're there yet as a culture. And I think it'll be a long time if we ever are. I think actually one of the Q&As, I think I asked Vervaeke something about that. And I think I said something like, do you think that'll become like a widespread thing? And he was like, I'd like it to, but probably not. Which was, somewhat encouraging and depressing at the same time.
Yeah, I really like the idea of some kind of synthesis of like a place for physical and mental training. Have like a gym or like a yoga studio, and then as well as maybe classes for teaching, as well as different rituals. Yeah, I think that would be kind of ideal in some ways. The question is just, once again, like, I feel like the narrative framework question, like, I still just, I don't know, I feel like there's got to be some kind of more than just, how John talks about cognitive sciences. Science is not either the kind of low level interfaith dialogue where they just talk and don't change anything, nor is it the opposite of that, where I feel like with multiculturalism and globalization, the potential of like real, I mean, maybe John would say dialogos, but like not integration to the extent that the religions are unified, at least not anytime soon, but something like what Nishitani did comparing Christianity. I feel like that sort of wellspring has not really been tapped as much as I feel like it definitely has the potential for. But then, of course, people within a given frame are often just going to view it from that frame. Yeah,
What do you
it just doesn't.
what do you think about the so Pageau has said on a couple of occasions that um, there's nothing wrong with the fact that people are viewing things from within a frame. Like that's the only way you can view them, right? And so
Yeah,
you have people within dialogue from different traditions who are operating from within their own respective frames. Um, I guess it's more so the issue I have is more so that um, there are people within traditions who treat their frame with a certain kind of hegemony that um, is incompatible sort of with a cosmopolitan like worldview, where it's like my frame has the priority, the hegemony over your frame. Like my frame matters more than yours, so to speak. It's better. It's more true. And to
yeah,
some extent, you might make the argument you have to believe that if you're going to operate in one frame over another, because why operate in one
right, right,
if you don't believe that, right? And I mean, one perspective could be, well, your frame only works, the reason you exist in your frame is because your frame works well for you. But it may not work as well for everybody else in terms of I guess that's kind of where I'm at right now in terms of like my own perspective on that issue. Like I would say I'm somewhat of a quasi-perennialist, not the traditionalist kind, but just a perennialist in the sense that I think the spiritual paths are all paths up the mountain, and that they work
mm-hmm.
more or less well depending on the person and a whole bunch of other complicated factors. Um, you know, and that's
Yeah,
kind
I
of
definitely. Sorry, yeah, I definitely think there is a kind of individual propensity for certain traditions being more effective and complementary to that person's personality, which I feel like the potential for that would be great to actualize instead of the more traditional method of everyone within a given locality, even if it is like massive and they only communicate symbolically, like something as large as the U.S., have to all be within the same framework. And I think one of the early talks, Vervaeke was speaking on how Taoism, for example, is non-theistic, and then Pageau does this thing where saying like, well, yes, but I'm not sure how Chinese we are. So that's the argument that like I'm always wondering what he would say to someone who grew up in China who has like a proper healthy relationship to their faith. I don't know about modern China, but as an example, and he said in other places that they all have like a similar structure. It's just that he thinks that Christianity is like the best of them, which I think is a far better argument than a lot of the ones I had growing up, where it's like it's the only true one rather than just the best. Like I can deal with people saying it's the best, even if they say eventually it would be like the best in general. That I would have to make the point that there's got to be some insights that they could integrate from other traditions to improve theirs, especially within a new environmental context. That I feel like that's the kind of work I'm interested in, which is obviously complicated because you don't want to go into a tradition trying to change it to some extent, because I feel like that's not really a healthy way to go about it. But then if you aren't in one, then it can be all the issues with autodidacticism, which like you said before in the Rebel Wisdom talk, Pageau was saying that if you do the MMA style, then it can often lead to people just picking whatever's easiest and not doing the hard work for developing spiritually and so on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I didn't know if you had anything to say on that, but
I think a couple of things. So in terms of this discussion about like a narrative framework surrounding this idea of like integrating ecologies of practice into wisdom traditions, I think that there's definitely work there that needs to be done, but I don't think there is a strong reason, at least in principle, why that work couldn't be done by the culture. I think Vervaeke is not the one for it, mainly because Vervaeke is very much an academic, and that's sort of his style and his approach. And like, I'm training to be an academic. I'm, more than happy with that. But that doesn't tend to scale well to the broader culture. Yeah. It's a very, how do I put it? It's an idiosyncratic way of thinking and talking, which most people don't relate to and don't find compelling on a deeply emotional level, which is what you need for anything to be genuinely religious in an important sense. But I do think there are a lot of people that are interested in this stuff that are trying to find ways of doing that and integrating other things like art and movement and dance and song and all these other things that are critical in religious life. So I definitely think like there's more work to be done there, and I don't think there's a reason in principle why it couldn't be done, other than perhaps the fact that if you look at the history of like religious, like sort of like evolution, you see that traditions like tend to evolve over very long periods of time.
Yeah, exactly.
In a very kind of like organic way.
Yeah.
Much more like, and so the question is like, can it really ever work if you're consciously engineering like
yeah,
ever really be like a viable sort of like religious tradition that would scale across like large communities or even the world, right? I don't know, right? There have been so few religious traditions that have managed to scale globally, right? I mean, there have been lots of religions, but very few that have actually ever scaled globally, right? Like relative to the number of like religious traditions that there have been. And, you can look at the structure of all these traditions and say, well, based on the structure of these traditions, these are the key elements that any religious tradition would need, and try and cobble it together based on that.
It's definitely a temptation for me to find out the underlying the grounds for all of them and just build it up from there.
Right.
I think that's the left hemisphere trying to be the master to some degree.
Exactly. It's systematizing, right? Yeah. It's what is the cognitive architecture of religion? I mean, that's a question like from my own like personal research is super interesting to me that like I'm thinking about all the time. And what grounds. There was a great paper that came out recently. I might send it to you. I think I sent it in the group chat for our religion group. It was all about like why some people report sensing the voice of God.
Yes.
Cultural study. It's very interesting, but it basically was an interaction effect between like the personality of the individual and then the cultural model that they were sort of operating under, which was rooted in the culture that they were in, and that it differed.
Yeah, wasn't it like more rural ones reported that more often?
Yeah,
I remember I skimmed it.
Yeah,
which makes sense to some extent.
Yeah, there's another psychologist, I can't remember their name, but they made an argument more or less similar where they argued it would make sense for people in more rural environments to experience other voices more frequently because of the lack of sensory stimulation. So you put people in isolation tanks, right? People very frequently hallucinate relatively quickly. In the absence of sensory stimulation, the brain keeps generating it. And so then the idea is that like, in the modern world that we live in, where we're surrounded by an overabundance of sensory stimulation, we're much less likely to have these kinds of experiences. I think there's actually something to that, and in a symbolic level, there's something about it that just feels really right. Like you know, people talk about the magic in the world going away, and that's like a very common trope
Mm,
in fantasy and fiction, where like the world, as the world becomes modern, the magic disappears, and it's like there's something there that's deep, like you
yeah.
know,
No,
because
I can definitely see that.
you certainly and you certainly, you know, in my own experience, I'm much more likely to have a spiritual experience in the woods than I am at church. You know,
Yes,
like
yes.
that's been the case for my whole life. You know, maybe that's a personality difference, but I also think there's something, you know, profound about that too, you know, because lots of other more devout people report the same thing.
No, I'm exactly the same way. And the thing with voices, I notice it's somewhat reliably if I get into like a almost a hypnagogic state, like barely wake while I'm reading something. Often tends to be, you know, kind of some of the books we're talking about. If it's really dense and relaxed, then I will start hearing just snippets of voices of other people in my head, and yeah, sometimes images will start to arise, and it's definitely, I think, related to that sensory deprivation, which is obviously in complete contrast to the sensory overload or like the combinatorial explosion of the internet and so on now. Um, and then what you said about in nature, I feel like this is actually one of my main critiques of Christianity and evanthology in general, as Alexander Bard calls it, where yeah, basically all of my what I would call spiritual experiences have been in nature, and um, I feel like where is the potential or context for that? At least in modern Christianity, like maybe there was monks living in the woods, like Saint Francis or something in medieval era, but I feel like there should, I don't know, not should. I mean, part of the appeal is that it's not structured, but I feel like there's this not so much now, but this paranoia to some extent in the Christian tradition of any mystical or spiritual or mystical experience in nature must be tied to paganism, and then therefore it's like not from God, and it's like it's demonic or something. And yet I feel like that that attitude, maybe it's related, I feel like to some extent it would be related to the issue that I've mostly been most passionate about for most of my life, is like the ecology and environmental sustainability, and like the current multi-layer collapse in different spheres of uh, of ecologies. And I just don't know, like if it's as bad as a lot of the reports say, I'm not sure if Christianity, for example, has the like necessary kind of uh, religious framework for any kind of radical shift to like a deep ecology or something because of the anthropocentrism, which I mean is part of, like, it's very deeply ingrained to some extent. And obviously I agree with Pageau about hierarchy. Like even if you just treat it from a cognitive science perspective of like the different complexity of um, cognition and presumably sensory experience between say an insect and a human and so on. But um, when there is that uh, point at which, like in the language of creation, where the space that keeps building and building gets to a point where it would out, what would you say, over extract the resources and shoot past its carrying capacity. Um, on a global scale, though, like where is the cultural and religious resources for that within, well, most traditions really, because I do think there's an evolutionary basis for which ones have survived to some extent, and pronatalism is obviously part of that. um yeah, like that sort of thing, like scaling back and so on,
Yeah,
to like purposely, instead of allowing the flood to come, as Matthew's cycle has it. um, yeah.
yeah. Well, it's interesting because you have this interesting fusion of like uh, symbolism that is both descriptive and prescriptive, right? So like, you know, at the purely descriptive level, I think like the Pageau brothers would sort of just say, well, it's inevitable that the flood is going to return, right? You know, and that sort of is a pattern that happens at every scale, right? And so there's presumably a global scale at which that pattern may manifest itself, or may not manifest itself. Um, you reminded me of something somewhat amusing. I had a conversation, amusing and horrifying. I had a conversation with a family member once, and most of my family members are like very like sort of fundamentalist. And I brought up the climate change issue, and they said, well, that's probably how the second coming of Christ is going to happen. I was like, I just about
Yeah.
lost my mind. I just about lost my mind. I was like, oh no. You know, and I think I see, non-sarcastically, I actually do see a lot of like fundamentalist Christians in a very similar camp to that, about, there's
Oh,
this kind of indifference to the ecological issues,
yes.
sort of like, well,
Yeah, it's almost
got
like,
time.
yeah, my mom is also kind of similar, where it's like they'll look at those issues as evidence for the eschaton, in a way that the evidence, or the climate collapse itself, is just kind of, I don't know about ammunition, but in and of itself is not something to be fixed, because they're very Gnostic, I would say, in the belief in an afterlife, and the world is just kind of like, it's just a temporary, testing ground or whatever. And I do appreciate Pageau for more or less subtly not taking that afterlife perspective. He's actually quite critical of that word, which I think is good for that attitude, which just leads to complete indifference toward other. I mean, not complete indifference, but just for the degree of impact that humans have had. That kind of like a shift in mindset, I feel like is
Mhm.
necessary, which is why I feel like there's a kind of need for like using the language of creation symbolism, a kind of return to the garden in some sense. And this actually is the image that Jonathan often talks about in Revelation. The final image is a garden surrounded by a city. And then you bring up the question of like whether you should try to create that, or you have to like wait and it's all going to happen without human effort, which I feel like is, I don't think it's that simple. So as long as you're kind of what do you say, yeah, like humble, not thinking you have like a utopian solution or whatever to how society and nature should be structured, but more like experimental. And yeah, that is definitely one of the things I'm most interested in, like Jordan Hall's Civium project. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it,
No,
where people
not.
would
I've heard
live,
the name, but
yeah, where they live more locally different, um, like sub Dunbar number communities that are close together, and then they're getting most of their food locally grown and so on, adapted to the local environment. And yet you would still have the internet for the capacity of, I forget all his language he uses, but basically the capacity for a huge number of minds to collaborate for innovation, which normally was restricted to the physical infrastructure of cities, which have all their problems, which are related to ecological collapse and so on. And I feel like that is in some ways perhaps the ideal solution, and conveniently looks similar to that image in Revelation that Pageau talks about,
mhm.
as opposed to the more Protestant simplified narrative of going to heaven. And I do appreciate his critique of that not even being biblical. So
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, no, I appreciate it too. Yeah, this is really interesting to me. I have a few thoughts. I guess one point of view might be that, and this is something I've thought about. I have some friends who, take a perspective that's more similar, I would say, to ours, but are still deeply committed to religious traditions. And from their point of view, their sort of project is to like, be the change they wish to see within their own traditions, right? And I think there's something um, I think that's a noble task. And I see Pageau doing that, and a number of other people, even Paul Weinergley and stuff like that. The question is, for me, it's like, are these traditions um, sustainable in a meaningful sense? because the culture is changing rapidly and it's secularizing at a tremendous rate. Now, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that will level out at some point, but it's hard to say how much, it'll change before it levels out. And Islam is rapidly growing as a religion as well, mainly because of demographic shifts. So it's, I guess from one point of view, you might say that if these religious traditions are here to stay for a very, very, very long time, and they may never change in the way that we might like them to, like a religion that's not a religion, might it be better to take the symbolism in something like language of creation and use that to sort of activate and re-energize concern for the ecological crisis and all these other things from the perspective of those traditions, right? Because there's a way in which you can do that. The question is, I think a lot of it is critical mass. Like, you have to have a certain number of people that are sort of like the elite of these institutions that are on board with that project, so to speak. And you would see the culture begin to change, broadly. But you have to have a critical mass for that to happen. And so part of the question is like, is it realistic? Is it a realistic project to expect there to be enough people that are interested in these things to attain a critical mass in these traditions, or are we better off jumping ship and putting our effort into the Sigium project and a number of other kind of local type things? And the wisdom traditions and the wisdom gyms and all these other things like that, because those are all things I'm very interested in. And I think at some point, I don't think I have anything quite like that where I'm at right now. I'm in Auburn, which is like right in the heart of the Bible Belt in the South. So it's about as conservative Protestant as it gets. So there's not a lot of people here that are really interested in those things. There probably are more than I suspect there are. But they're all on the internet, right? So you got to just find them. It's like, if it's realistic to, expect that as a possibility, I might say, because there's already scalable communities, you better luck with that. But I don't know. I don't know which of those is more plausible. And that's part of the reason why I think I struggle so much with that choice. Is like, I'm not even sure which of these is the better ship to put my odds with. I guess I don't know.
I think we need both culturally, like we were saying before. The people you mentioned, your friends who are trying to kind of reinvigorate or update to some degree their traditions from within, who are committed to it nonetheless. I think it is the best way for those to adapt to the context, not even necessarily just of the culture, but of like the environment itself, for the continuation of the traditions and humans as well, but more broadly as well. Whereas like the ideas can be introduced from people outside the traditions for sure, and then I think those outside maybe should focus more on like the experimenting, like you said, with such communities, and then more on like the infrastructure side, and allowing for hopefully a continuing dialogue between the traditions and those outside them, to mediate and collaborate, which I feel like is pretty essential, and which I feel like John's work is potentially, well, at least for me, it seems quite uniquely rich in that respect.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think I definitely agree that there's an important need for both of those. And like from a symbolic perspective, right, it's like filling out all the space in the hierarchy, right? You've got your more rigid aspects, you have your more loose aspects, you have your water and your earth, your heaven and your hell, or heaven and earth, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And so I definitely see the need for it. I guess it doesn't quite answer the personal question. And perhaps one perspective is the personal question is just go with whatever seems to call to you the most. whatever seems to get your heart going, I guess, so to speak, whatever your heart longs for, maybe, perhaps, and that's a signal that that's your path, perhaps. But I go back and forth on it, for sure.
Yeah, I also instinctually agree with like I was and still am quite a fan of Joseph Campbell, for example, and then his most famous line on following your bliss, and then Vervaeke's idea of transjectivity. I felt like helped me to crystallize perhaps more um, grounded and rich understanding of that meaning is relational between the subject and the object, and therefore, yeah, that kind of dynamism is something that's never fixed. So I feel like that is kind of related to what Campbell was getting at, and that in combination, like what is most meaningful to you, in combination with where you feel like you can do the most good with your proficiencies and skills and interests, is I think the best path for individuals. It's just always interesting to like look at the culture and see what the large scale things that are needed would be from an armchair, but then try to at least do the small part you can to bring that about. And then yeah, I also obviously like Vervaeke's phrase of the psychologically indispensable but not metaphysically necessary, which sounds perhaps to those committed to a tradition kind of flippant, until you maybe realize how major the words psychologically and indispensable are to a cognitive scientist. That's what I always like to think. Yeah.
I mean, it's a way of saying I cannot do without this, right?
Yeah.
But just because you cannot do without it doesn't mean that it's true in a metaphysical sense. But yeah, no, I like that phrase, that turn of phrase. I think that's probably one of my favorite things about Vervaeke is this extraordinary ability to invent vocabulary that is incredibly apt.
Yes.
It's remarkable. I haven't met. There's very few people I've met that have skill quite like that, and so it's one of the things I appreciate about Vervaeke. I think like in the context of like Ian McGilchrist's work, I think a lot of this conversation is really relevant. Especially to a lot of the Project Civium stuff, kind of reducing the overabundance of the left hemisphere mode in culture, and getting us into more spaces in which we have the opportunity to sort of like activate our more empathic, more embodied, more dynamic selves, I guess. And we've built our culture in such a way that I find that we're often sort of, I guess what I'm trying to say is we built our culture in such a way that makes that difficult. So like I'm currently a graduate student, so most of my day, and I'm a research assistant in my lab, so most of my day I spend doing like research in the lab. So most days I'm just sitting behind a computer screen, like looking at numbers, which is like, I enjoy the research I'm doing and it's interesting, but it's pretty much entirely left hemisphere mode, right? Like it's just, and then at night I come home and I read like all this like spiritual stuff, and it's like, it's almost like I'm trying to like fix it, it's like I gotta get
balance it. Yeah.
But it's hard, you only have so many hours in the day, and the way we've built our cultures makes that very difficult for, I think, most people. And so these sort of experimental communities, I think, are really important for that. And I think there's a lot of like fruitful insight to be gathered from there. You brought up the transjectivity for a moment, and I wanted to touch on that because I think there's an interesting relationship or way in which the idea of the imaginal can be linked to transjectivity in a way that makes it, I guess, compatible with a naturalistic framework. Because I think another aspect of my interest in religious study is understanding how religious experiences are sort of like cognitively enabled, and how they come about, how they arise, and sort of like the neurophysiology, I guess, in some important senses of religious or mystical experience. And typically in the academic study of religion, people are all like, oh, it's all about mindfulness, you know, it's all about meditation, because that's just sort of the intellectual fad right now.
Yeah.
And you don't see as much work like the paper I sent to our discussion group about like sensing the voice of God or other sorts of more bizarre paranormal type experiences, which are actually quite common for a lot of people. I think they're more common than our culture permits them to be.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Did you ever read Julian Jaynes' Origin of the Bicameral Mind? Origin of
Read it.
Consciousness in the Breakdown
I
Bicameral Mind?
read a summary of it though. So I don't, I don't know if I got the picture, but my understanding is that he more or less makes the argument that um, in more ancient cultures, people used to experience their own thoughts as external voices, something like that, or at least that's one of the arguments he makes.
Yeah, I think that was pretty close to the core thesis. My impression was that it was like the equivalent of Wernicke's area in the right hemisphere was speaking, which is odd because McGilchrist talks about right hemisphere doesn't have the capacity for speech in some sense, but that they heard and maybe also saw images from the right hemisphere and interpreted those as something from the gods or whatever, and
Yeah,
that over time this ability was lost in like the symbols, the prophets and the oracles started looking for more, you know, arbitrary things to give their riddles or whatever, because they're starting to lose that capacity. And yeah, McGilchrist, I think, said he agrees basically with his thesis, but that he would just flip it to, instead of the hemispheres breaking apart, that they were unified, and that's what led to the consciousness that no longer heard the voice of the gods as they did in like the Bronze Age and so on.
yeah, no, that's really interesting. I'm not, so I'm somewhat skeptical of the hemisphere unification argument or disunification argument, um, at least at the level of like that, like within that time frame, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
evolutionary speaking, my understanding is that the hemispheres would have been connected to people much, much, much longer ago than
Yeah.
would be relevant at any level of like actual recorded history, right? Um,
Right.
but I'm definitely open to the idea of communication, of people experiencing their communication in that way. And I think that can sometimes happen to people. I was listening to an interesting podcast some time ago, where they invited this guy on, and he talked about how he had this experience for a long period of time where he was more or less having a very common auditory hallucination where he was hearing the voice of God speaking to him, like telling him things. Um, sometimes telling him about people he was talking to, or criticizing him, or sometimes giving him compliments, or just like a bunch of different things, right? Um, and then for years he went with this thing, and he never really seemed to question it all that much until one point it became really distressful. He ended up going to a psychiatrist. The psychiatrist put him on antidepressants, and then boom, gone, never came
Mm.
back. So it's very, very, um, interesting. Not something you would really expect, but we know far less about neurophysiology out of all the facts that there are to know than than we might like to. So I guess I think there is an important way in which this idea of like the imaginal is very much connected to like intersubjective experience that's experienced in a sort of like it's almost like internally enacted symbolism in some sense, where it's like
Mm.
you have these like internally enacted like representations of like, and oftentimes it's like visual experience, like visions, but sometimes it's auditory experience or like some connection of both of those, or like multisensory. Um, so I don't know. I think that's an interesting idea. I do like the at least the idea of the historical argument. There was a point where people were more prone to these kinds of experiences, but have become less prone because of the way our cultures have changed.
Well, and it could also be tied to having less constant sensory overload, like we were saying earlier,
Mhm.
being in nature more. Um, yeah, uh, I agree that they could be connected to the transjective and the imaginal. I also want to one of the main points I was interested in was how I feel like in Matthew Pageau's book, it almost seemed like he emphasized time and space more than heaven and earth, which is interesting, and how it seemed to me to some degree that space was kind of or could be correlated with the left hemisphere and time with the right hemisphere.
Mm, yeah.
I feel like you can perhaps tie that to like the overall trajectory, like what John talked about with Heidegger's critique of Western metaphysics, how it's kind of like reason or rationality in the more left hemisphere sense of it, gradually gaining more and more power. And then also, as McGilchrist traces the history in his book, um, to the point that like the right hemisphere is kind of being suppressed in some sense, even though it's like the origin and the final return for that loop he talks about, um, and how in the language of creation book, nonetheless, the space, which is like the left hemisphere, it seems to me, is emphasized as like the better of the two, or like the proper relationship between heaven and earth is space. And then for like 6 of the days of creation, and then you just leave a tiny little sliver to let the steam valve of chaos out, which was time, which seems like the reverse of what McGilchrist is arguing, where the right hemisphere has been overtaken throughout more and more throughout civilization inappropriately by the left hemisphere. And it seemed to me the language of creation book was kind of uh, articulating that, and in a way I feel like maybe it's understandable because the Israelites were recently kind of culturally evolving out of paganism and then like more hunter-gatherer religion, which I feel like actually does emphasize the circular time, like Alexander Bard calls nomadology, where everything returns to the same like season-based rituals and so on, versus eventology, which is more linear time, and there's like a eschatology and so on, and an origin point. And yeah, it seems to me like along with Zoroastrianism was technically the first, I think, but Judaism was like um, maybe the second major example of that that provided the foundation later for Christianity for that eventological linear trajectory, which if you tie that to some extent to the left hemisphere, I feel like would lead to kind of what Heidegger critiques as like the history of metaphysics, is the history of nihilism, and then potentially like ecological degradation and so on. And that's why I was feeling like there's an interesting idea that, for example, the fall out of the garden, I feel like could be correlated with the Neolithic Revolution and the shift from hunter-gatherer foraging lifestyles to agricultural lifestyles, and then the beginning of civilization. Because he talks about how you have to artificially now join heaven and earth through like technology and like plowing instead of just gathering the fruits and hunting the animals where everything was right at hand in the garden. Um, and there's that more self-consciousness that comes with it, like when they had to cover themselves, like similar to what Vervaeke talks about, how language around the time of civilization gave more people like reflective ability to be self-conscious of their own prior thoughts and so on. And yeah, I feel like if you take that the Genesis story in that way as talking about the shift from like animistic hunter-gatherer culture to the beginnings of civilization, at least to me, it's like a very very helpful framework that I think actually is historically, real and true in some large sense for the history of humans. But I feel like right now is with the ecological sustainability issues and so on, and the climate, I feel like there's that need, and you can see it to some extent on the left of like reinvigorating or bringing back some of the wisdom of indigenous cultures, like Native American cultures and other animistic cultures. And I know Rafe Kelly talked about this with Paul Van der Klee as well, where C.S. Lewis was kind of trying to reach back to that with all the animals in Narnia being able to talk and so on. Like there's a kind of nostalgic yearning for that original participation, as the other Inkling Barfield talks about. I don't know if you're familiar with his trajectory of original participation and then kind of like the breakdown where it's more the left hemisphere thing. I think you can correlate to McGilchrist as well, and then final participation where they're both integrated. And I feel like we're in that transitional liminal phase right now where we need to reintegrate some of that more animistic, ecological, time-based, in the language of creation, cyclical knowledge, and have both, because I appreciate in the language of creation he has the covenant or the synthesis being like space crowned by time. I feel like right now time, the cyclical thing, is something that we need to like go into without letting the spatial structure crumble, obviously, but to like recover or renew, because it is the renewal aspect, the time dimension is like renewal and resurrection even. To go back that far into the past, which I feel like Christianity doesn't have the, at least maybe just in Genesis, doesn't have the grammar for, other than saying like, yeah, we have to go back to Eden and like recover those lost ways again and reintegrate them with civilization, which I'm sure will sound heretical to a lot of people because they're just like saying, oh no, we have to wait until it just happens. Yeah, that's my thoughts.
Yeah. It's almost as if though people have this perception that, well, it makes me think of a funny story, which I've heard people tell before, where it's like the person who is stranded out at sea, and he prays to God to send a ship, and then a ship comes by, and then they're like, hey, can we help you? And he's like, no, God will save me.
Yeah, exactly. I like
And
that
then
story.
and then he dies and he gets to heaven and he's like, God, what the heck? And he's like, like, work with me.
Yeah.
I think people have this weird. It's almost like people are doing that on a very large, like, collective level. Where it's just like.
Mm-hmm.
No, but it's interesting. I want to say I really appreciate all the connections that you made between those different pieces, because I hadn't quite connected them in that way. But as you were saying it, there were like a lot of like individual light bulbs going off. So I really appreciate that. I think I like that participation aspect, like invoking on Barfield. I read his Saving the Appearances like last year, and it was really great. And I think there's definitely a connection there between the hemispheres and kind of that idea of like a reintegration. And I think it's interesting. I guess I'm currently, I would say my current perspective is I'm unsure if Christianity has the grammar for it. I would say I hope Christianity has the grammar for it, but I'm not certain it does.
Yeah.
And,
I feel like
I guess for me, the issue is like whether or not Christianity has the grammar will be up to individual Christians in some sense. Like it will be up to people like Jonathan Pageau, and really not just him, but the elites within any given religious tradition, to sort of come together and to say like, the Lord made us stewards of the earth. We're not being good stewards to the earth.
Yeah, that, I don't know if that language is taken from it, but that's at least reasonable language where you can have a conversation about these things, that terminology. I just feel like the origin of, like in the Old Testament, because the Israelites had just kind of recently, you could say culturally evolved out of animistic paganism, they were hypersensitive to all of its shortcomings, and so they just really emphasized the space side of the equation. Whereas now, I feel like we're kind of seeing the ultimate manifestation of emphasizing that is kind of like a technological totalitarian state, really, where nature is just purely objectified for utility and so on. And yeah, I mean, he does have, like, you have to have that balance, but I feel like there's a critical moment of like reaching like way deep into prehistory. Like that's perhaps one of the blind spots where 99% of human history has been like hunter-gatherer cultures under the Dunbar's number, and that kind of wisdom, I think, is needed, especially in an arena like the internet. I don't know how accurate this is, but like Marshall McLuhan argued that we're kind of returning to like a retribalization with the internet, where because there's so much information, people will just naturally go into their own little miniature tribes. And that's kind of what we're seeing, like in the what do you call it, constantly expanding nodes of the culture war, and just like yeah, that sort of tribal mentality. But it's I mean, it's not embodied, for one, and it's also kind of divorced from all the, well, yeah, from a proper wisdom tradition, of course.
Mhm. Yeah, no, I'm with you there. I think there's something interesting about that. I mean, I think you see that in the emergence of a lot of like internet echo chambers, especially like internet conspiracy theories, which
Yeah,
like, you know, basically sort of artificially create like small tribes, more or less. Um, and the more obscure the conspiracy theory is, the smaller the tribe is, and also the louder. Um,
yeah,
and so that can tend to dominate the discourse. I definitely think there is this like dynamic uh, balancing act, and we're at a very odd place in our cultural history that makes it very difficult, I think, to know how, as individuals, to navigate it. At least if you're aware of the issues and you're aware of the connections between them. Um, and so, I think like, I guess that's sort of characteristic of the age that we're living in to some degree, is that we are, I think the word that's what it was. You said liminal, I think was the word that you,
yes, I love using that word for our era.
yeah. Liminal is a great one. This profound transitory state, where there's a lot of opportunity, and a lot of danger.
Yeah,
Um, and you know the and so, I mean, in another way, if we want to like contextualize this conversation to make it as significant as possible, we're talking about whether or not human beings will survive. The future of the race itself. And so, I think these are all really great areas to keep exploring. I was going to say, in terms of the time space stuff, I think that we're at a place where all of us are going to have to learn how to surf.
yes, exactly.
There's a lot of water coming.
Good way to put it. Yeah, and I was also just thinking about how like the rising sea levels could be connected as like, the next global flood, as it
Yeah.
was in Genesis.
Well, and it's funny that I'm somewhat surprised and a little bit miffed that the more people in this symbolic space aren't, kind of making that into like a hashtag, like the flood is coming.
Yeah, I know.
That needs to be like an
It's
environmental activist hashtag the flood is coming.
yeah, it's much
It's true
much
in a
more
symbolic
apt
kind
than
of way.
winter is coming.
What? Way more apt than winter. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Sorry, what were you saying that last thing?
Wasn't that George R. R. Martin's like? Wasn't that actually supposed to be a metaphor for climate change?
Yes, it was.
Was it?
And within the context of the story, I like it, but
Yeah.
for our context, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like those those that want to commit to a tradition, even if they're not fundamentalist, like I said, I feel like Pageau is the healthiest manifestation of traditionalism. At least that's popular that I'm familiar with, but it's still tied to a given historical context, even if that context is like most of human civilization. Human civilization is 1% of human existence, and the changing context may be so radical that the symbolic structures that did work may not be completely, and certainly not completely apt. And Mathieu makes that point that space is coherence and time is completeness. And I kind of liked that dynamic. They'd be like opponent processing, right, with the Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. And I tend to favor completeness by nature. But yeah, there has to be some kind of balance. And I feel like those that do commit are kind of like saying, all right, we're getting in our arc when the flood's coming, and we know it's pretty good. But then I'm always like, oh, but it could be better, and we could like integrate and build a lot of armadas with more more efficient technology within them. in the symbolic, cultural, religious sense, of course. Um, yeah, I mean, that's what the time and the left is. And I do think they correlate to left and right. It's like the left is potential and always seeing like the possibility for improving change and so on. Which, yeah, I think is definitely tied to high openness, which I'm like maxed out on.
Yeah, I like that. What's interesting about that is it seems to me like, Christianity is very biased in a left hemispheric sense in that way,
Mm,
in at least in its current cultural manifestation. Whereas, from the very beginning, Taoism was very much more completeness over
yeah,
coherence. Um,
yeah,
and it's interesting how these dynamics tend to change across traditions, between traditions, and within traditions. Um, you know, what's ironic though is that, in Christianity, the person on the left is supposed to be Satan, right? It's like Christ is on the right hand of the Father.
mm, yeah,
So it's like there's almost like a symbolic tension there, where it's like there is definitely a symbolism that has an appreciation and a respect for like the completeness in Christianity, but it's lopsided in a strange way, where it's like partially like, yeah, the right is the best, but also the left is
yes,
the best.
exactly. Like Jonathan did a video on the icon of the Last Judgment, and then it is like the sheep are being brought in to the right, but it's on the left hand of the picture itself, or maybe it was flipped. But it makes sense from the hemispheres where he talked about the right hand is basically space and structure and judgment and so on, and also maybe heaven. And then the left hand is
Mhm.
like change and dissolution and the flood. And someone brought up the point where like the sin, and he does talk about the sins of the right hand and the sins of the left, which I like, where the right hand is sin is arrogance and thinking that it is self-sufficiency and so on, and then the left hand is like lack of discipline and all the associated, a lot of the seven deadly sins related to like addiction and so on.
Yeah.
And that all made sense. And someone was saying, okay, so like the right hand is fire and brimstone when it gets to extreme, and the left is the flood when it gets to extreme. And he agrees, but then also says, but you do have to remember, in the end, it's like the right hand is the kingdom, and the left hand goes down to the fire or something. And then I'm like, wait, that doesn't seem to match if they're both. I mean, to some extent it does, but I do feel like it's a left hemisphere bias of like kind of Western civilization and rationality in general, especially
Mhm.
compared to a lot of the Eastern traditions. um, and maybe that is part of the influence with that dialectic of the hemispheres that's needed to synthesize and have
Mhm.
the space crowned by time or whatever
Yeah.
now.
Well, what's interesting too is there is this. I might make the argument, and maybe this is controversial, I don't know, but I might make the argument to the degree that a religion prioritizes something like final answers or like a final paradisal state where everything is perfect and unchanging, um, that it's probably more likely that that left hemisphere bias is more likely to be a prevalent feature of that religious tradition, As you see in other
Yeah,
like traditions that tend to prioritize like more of the right hemisphere perspective, there's less of an emphasis on this like final state of like perfection. Um, a lot of the
yeah,
traditions are very much grounded in time and change, and the fact that everything is impermanent. It
yeah,
all comes and it goes. And like each tradition has an aspect that is grounded in some sense, on things that are like, you have nirvana, which is like the ultimate unconditioned state, right? And then you have like the return to God, like the Brahman soul, the Vedic tradition, things like that. Um, but I think, it's kind of a matter of emphasis. And in terms of what
hmm
gets emphasized, it's like this complex interaction between the culture and the contingencies in the environment. And I think environmentally speaking, we're very much in a place where chaos looms. I think it's one of the reasons why like Peterson's first book was about order and his second book is about chaos, right? In his 12 Rules for Life corpus. Um, or other way around, like how to an antidote to chaos, then like beyond order, right? Um,
hmm
and I definitely see, you know, this like sort of like liminal like spiritual homelessness that is like so common among people now as a manifestation, as part of that chaos, where the old
Yeah.
structures of meaning making are sort of disintegrated or disintegrating before our eyes, and we're kind of having to surf in the ocean, so to speak. It's actually interesting. I'm curious. There's a movie that I really like. I don't know if you've ever seen it. It's called Life of Pi.
Oh yeah, I love it.
Yeah, it's probably my favorite movie and book actually.
Oh.
And I don't know if you've read the book or not, but it's a very faithful adaptation. One of the
Okay.
better, like in terms of being like to the source material, it's pretty much identical. A couple of like small changes here and there, but nothing like that really changes the symbolism of the film. Um, and it's very interesting. Um, I find it very compelling, and it's connected to a lot of these concepts because, you know, more or less you have these two different stories, you know, and one you could think of as being like, if we're connecting this to the language of creation, you can think of one story, which is the first story we get is the spiritual story, and then the second story is the material story. It's like the story with
Mm.
earthly meaning versus the heavenly meaning. um, you know, in Pi at the end, you know, he's sort of confronted, and it's like, you know, here's these two different stories. um, you know, they are explanations of the same events, but which one is the better story? You know, that's the one I choose, right? And like, you know, so it is with God, is like, you know, go with the better story, so to speak. And so, you know, part of it, uh, I would say for me, that's probably the most profound uh, critique you could make from the symbolic traditionalist perspective of this sort of like emerging like religion that is not a religion, ecology of practice, this sort of thing, is you can say like, yeah, but at the end of the day, like which of these alternatives offers you a better story? And you could, you know, I think more people at the present moment would settle on the religious story than they would on that. But
Yeah.
I think that's because there's more work to be done, not necessarily because
Yes.
true in some ultimate metaphysical sense.
Yes. Exactly. Like the best story would be relevant for the time that people live in, and with something as, you know, large and rich as like the Bible, for example, you can interpret the things in such a way as they can be like highly flexible and expansive. But when it gets to the point of, like I was saying, because it's based on, for example, civilization as opposed to like tribal hunter-gatherer mode of existence, then like all the symbols are kind of based on perpetuating that kind of human lifestyle and culture, which may not always be um, the ideal the ideal one matched to the environment, for example. And I feel like, yeah, at the current moment, it's like either people don't have the patience and they kind of want to go back to, understandably, to some kind of tradition that offers a coherent story, uh, versus trying to not craft, I guess, but contribute to the emergence of a new meta narrative. I think one that, at least from my perspective, the key element that has to be integrated is um, evolution in like all its senses. Like especially like Greg Henrique's Tree of Life. I don't know if you're familiar with his talks
Yeah,
with John.
really, oh, that's a whole nother conversation in and of itself.
Oh yeah, I think the correlations between his model and Pirsig, the guy who wrote Lila and Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, are quite um, there's a lot of overlap there that I think would be helpful. And yeah, like within a time of liminality or whatever, that kind of model of evolution and becoming, I feel like is the I more closer to the ideal, even if it's not currently like worked out enough or, you know, popular enough. And obviously there can be a lot of bad interpretations, like was it Darwin's cousin, and then obviously the interpretation of the Nazis and so on, of the more material biological evolutionary social Darwinism and so on. But I think I mean, it's what inspired John's idea of relevance realization anyway, as a bioeconomy. The idea of evolution is like such a fundamental shift, I feel like, in our yeah, metaphysics and historical understanding. I don't know if Hegel took it into account, but that's a sort of thing like dialectics. I feel like that allows for more evolution in keeping with the massive rate of change due to technology. That it would
Yeah.
be better suited than like a coherent but perhaps partly outdated one, even at its best, like Pageau's argument.
Yeah, I think for me, I really appreciate that. And I think uh, I would say if there were any major thing I'd want to add to it, which is related, is just this lack of a radical separation between mind and life. That mind and life are deeply continuous with one another, and that they're cut from the same cloth, so to speak. Um, which is in some ways, I mean, it depends kind of on how you parse these distinctions, like philosophically. Um, there's
Mm-hmm.
a lot more people that have been attracted lately to panpsychism in the intellectual
Yeah,
world. It seems to
that's
be,
me.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, there you go. It seems to be this middle option between brute emergence and dualism, more or less.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, and I have a lot of sympathies with panpsychism. I think like if you would describe my theological views, I'd probably say something like panentheism or something like that. So like
Yeah, that's the word
panpsychism.
I like to use in the Christian context. It's like, can we agree on this middle term? Because I feel like, yeah, I'm also very much attracted to like process theology, like Whitehead, even before we did the Whitehead book. So yeah, I'm totally on board with panentheism as perhaps a mediating term for integrating the best of like East and West, and like Vervaeke's deep continuity hypothesis and so on,
Yeah.
with a spiritual language.
And you take like even like in Buddhism they have this form is emptiness, emptiness is form. Like you can extend that to matter and spirit, or mind and body, or these are all ways of referring to the same basic principle, which is that there isn't a radical separation between them, that they're deeply continuous with one another, and that um, uh, all matter has a component which could be described as sort of the prefiguration of the mental in some sense. And
Mm-hmm.
organized in particular ways gives rise to mental activities but the idea of thinking about the mind as having a particular kind of substance or essence is something that I want to just X out of the intellectual ecosystem. If I had my magic wand, I think it would solve a lot of problems in a lot of spaces, not just the religious and symbolic spaces, but even like in the culture where I think there are issues that I think that would help to resolve. Of course, it will cause other issues, but um, I definitely think that's an important aspect of, like, to the degree that there's like a new meta narrative, so to speak, that operates as a powerful cultural alternative to traditional religion. I think it has to incorporate evolution, like you said, but also this lack of a separation between mind and life. Um, that being said, I do think there is still a mind body problem to be addressed in a scientific way. Um, whether or not that's possible in principle to find a solution in or if it even makes sense to speak in that language, I don't know. That's something I don't think I'm educated enough on the topic to really say. And I know a lot of people have, their agreements and disagreements on those topics. Consciousness is something, I would say consciousness is actually the thing that drew me to neuroscience to begin with.
Mm.
When I started college, I was an English major, and my original plan was to teach English literature. But then I just became interested in all these philosophical and like existential questions, and it was all tied to like the loss of my religious tradition, right? And so in my spare time, I'm just like thinking about this stuff all the time. And then you know, I kind of encountered neuroscience and I fell in love with it. But I think I fell in love with it because I encountered it through consciousness. They're like, because it's
Mm,
like, oh, people are starting to study this in the lab now, cool, you know, and then
yeah.
I got into neuroscience and that was kind of where things went.
Yeah, I still need to finish John's series on the hard problem with Greg Henriquez. Did you watch that?
Yeah, I did. It was an excellent series. I think it's probably the best content on the issue of consciousness on all of the internet that I've seen. I mean, at
Yeah.
least you can watch, like not,
Right,
not
right.
have to read. Um,
Yeah.
I've read a few books on the topic too. There's one, if you're interested in consciousness broadly from a scientific point of view, I'd highly recommend one by Jeffrey Gray. I think it's called The Heart Problem or over here. Yeah, so it's called Consciousness Creeping Up on the Heart Problem.
Mm,
Uh, I read this last year, kind of like at the beginning of last year. This is actually a book Jordan Peterson recommended to me.
mm, interesting.
Enough, I had a chance to meet Peterson once. It's kind of a
Nice.
funny story how it happened. I went to see his debate with Sam Harris in Vancouver.
Ah.
And the reason I ended up seeing it was I was on the Sam Harris Facebook page. Somebody on the Facebook page said, "Hey, I have an extra ticket. Does anyone want to go with me?" And it just so happened that this person happened to live in the same state as I did. And I had never met them before. And I just messaged them and I was like, "Yeah, man, that sounds really fun." They were like, "Yeah, let's meet up." And we found out we lived in the same state. And we are like, "Yeah." So we like went out, we became friends. And then we like went and we attended the event. But the funny part was at the very, I didn't get a chance to meet Peterson at the event itself, just because there were so many people and, you know, he was on stage and all that stuff. Um, I ran into him at the airport as I was leaving the day after.
Hmm.
I'm like in line, like putting my passport into the little kiosk. And then I look over to my right and him and his wife were right there doing it in the next kiosk. And I was like, wow. I came up to him and I just, you know, introduced myself and we chatted for a couple of minutes. It was pretty fun.
Awesome. So were you and the other guy maybe more in line with Sam Harris's perspective at that point, or were you familiar with Peterson also?
Question. You know, it was actually great because he was like totally a Sam Harris fanboy. And at this point, I was like totally a Peterson fanboy.
Ah, nice.
So we had like a bunch of like really fierce arguments about it afterwards. Um,
Yeah, those are classics.
you know, it was great. I mean, I think it's funny though because like now I'm in a such different place than I think I was then. So it's like I don't even know where.
Mm,
But yeah, I like Peterson a lot. I don't really care much for his political stuff. I just am more interested in his
mhm.
religious and symbological stuff. Especially because I felt like a lot of the religious stuff he was espousing was something that was absent in the culture in an important way that was needed.
Yeah.
Um, and it's hard for me to articulate exactly what it was, but I think it was a very, I think it was a very, I think Peterson is a very, was at least in the context of like his persona, a very good exemplar of like healthy order to some degree.
Yeah,
I think for a lot of people. Um,
I agree.
it's
And
ironic that,
conscientiousness.
yeah, it's somewhat ironic that like things fell apart for him quite as badly as they did right before he publishes his book about chaos. You
Yeah,
know,
that's
I'm like,
interesting.
I can't help but notice some symbolism there, you know.
Yeah.
Perhaps I'm projecting, but
Yeah, I'd love to see more talks between him and John, especially on Jung, because I feel like John and Anderson Todd had some nice counterpoints on Peterson's interpretation of Jung. And yeah, Peterson's interpretation of for example, um, Christ as like the overlord of the dominance hierarchy. I mean, if you see it in like the paradoxical way of the cross, it makes sense, but not in like a chimpanzee type way, really.
not really.
Um, yeah,
It's a
it feels a lot forced sometimes. He kind of has like a brilliant imagination, but I feel like his autodidactic solution is it has some weird what would you say, like missing pieces in the Jenga tower or something. I don't know how to say it.
yeah. No, I definitely get where you're coming from. I think the Jung one is probably the one that bothers me the most. I think Jung was the first. I want to say maybe my introduction to these sorts of things was probably Alan Watts, and then it was Jung. Like I went Alan
Mm,
Watts and then Jung, and those were like my first. You know, they always say like your first philosopher, so to speak, is like your like Vervaeke says your first philosopher is like your first girlfriend or something like that. You
yeah.
know, it just shapes all your future experiences. And I feel like Watts and Jung were kind of like together because I was reading them both at the same time, you know, and
Mm.
and that was like, oh, but it was a while ago. I think that was like right when I was finishing high school. I was like 2014, so you know, it feels like it was 50 years ago, even though I guess it was really only 7, but or 8.
Yeah, I guess for me it is indirectly Jung, even like when I was still in like middle school or something, just via the MBTI, which I got completely obsessed with along with the Enneagram.
Which
And so I still
you
have like
gotta
all
tell me
that old
your
stuff.
MBTI type. you, gotta,
What's that? Sorry.
you gotta tell me your MBTI type, or should I try and guess it? I don't know. I don't know
Oh
about your.
yeah, I can try to guess yours too. Do you know yours?
I do, yeah.
Okay. Well,
Mine
yeah,
has changed, so it depends on which one I go with.
oh,
But it's always been like between two. It goes back and forth.
okay. Um,
It's forewarning.
yeah, so you think it can change then, which is more of like what, the big five model? Yeah, I just think it's a useful heuristic like most.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Um, I would guess I one of the INPs, I guess,
Hmm.
maybe
Yeah, yeah. No, you're
for
close.
you.
The very first time I ever took it, it was INFJ, and
Oh,
then
or that, yeah. See, INTPs and INFJs can look alike because they both have introverted thinking. Yeah.
yep, yep. And then I always go back and forth between that and P. It's either INFJ or INFP. Now,
Okay.
I think if I had to guess for you, let me think about this for a moment. INTJ.
INTP,
Oh, there you go. So okay, there you go. Close, close.
which, yeah, I was deciding between that and INFP for a while there, but yeah, it was never had much doubt about JP difference, which I think you can absolutely correlate to like, well, so many things. Um, the P is kind of like the time axis, more right hemisphere, more openness, but lower conscientiousness, and then J is the opposite of all those. Yeah.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. What's interesting is that I it's so funny about the, and it's ironic in a way that's somewhat unfortunate. My conscientiousness has declined dramatically, I think, over time rather than increased. And
Interesting.
back the very first time I took this assessment, I was highly conscientious. And I think all the more recent times I've gotten INFP and I'm much less conscientious than I used to be. So maybe there is
Huh.
actually a relationship there. Um,
And
you know, you
despite changing your major to something that seems more.
well, so I would say in high school, I was definitely somewhat of a toxic perfectionist. Um, you know, to the degree that was psychologically unhealthy. Um,
Hmm.
and in undergrad, I just let go of it. Like I had like a Piagetian stage transition. Like I just, you know, I
Huh.
went like, you know, it gets done if it
I
gets done.
see.
So now I'm trying to learn how to be conscientious again because I'm in grad school and I kind of have to be.
Yeah, I think I had somewhat of a similar thing where I never wanted to make mistakes, and then yeah, it's sort of like that. Um, what was the other thing? Yeah, I was also interested what you thought of. Well, it's sort of related. So, do you still think like a symbolic mind-body dualism is pragmatically useful for like understanding it all, like the heaven and earth distinction, for example, in the language of creation, even if you might take a more double aspect monistic approach in terms of the actual underlying structures?
That's an interesting question. Whether or not it's symbolically useful. Um, ooh, man, that's tough. That is really a tough question because I think it depends on how you relate to that as a symbol. Because I think a lot of problems in our culture come from taking like mind body dualism in a literal way rather than a symbolic way. And it depends on, I guess how flexible you're able to be with your symbolic interpretation and when to apply it.
Mm.
Because I think in terms of like understanding um, something like cognition or emotion or personality, which are like kind of all the three things I'm most interested in, I don't find mind-body dualism to be a helpful metaphor at all. I find that it tends
Mm.
to obscure far more than clarify. But that's more from a scientific perspective, right? If you're trying to understand
Right.
how these things work in a scientific way. Um, Whereas, you know, from the symbolic question, it's more like, how can you help people sort of transcend or like, you know, attain sort of spiritual growth, I guess, is sort of the perspective. And I think at some level there is utility in a symbolic mind-body dualism at a certain stage of like spiritual
Mm.
practice, but that at another stage it has to be dropped.
Mm. Okay.
I think like it's useful in the sense that like I think it's a helpful metaphor to think in some cases, you know, in the context of like learning discipline or mastery of oneself, right? There is a certain helpfulness in sort of separating the mind and the body, right? Like the flesh is willing, or the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak, right? You know, or like the impulses of the flesh, learning to like rein those in and like, you know, develop control and mastery over oneself. I think there's something helpful about that, but there are also ways in which that's unhelpful to developing those skills too,
Mm.
because it creates. I think it's part of the reason why in Christianity, it's not the only reason, of course, but it's part of the reason why there's like a lot of toxic shame dynamics,
Yeah.
where you know, where there's this like radical disconnection from the body is bad,
Yeah.
don't inhabit the body, inhabit the spirit is good, the body is bad, kind of a thing.
Yeah.
So I guess it just depends on the symbolic sophistication. Like I was listening to like a conversation Pageau had, I think it was with what was his name? One of those YouTube rationalist atheist people. I always like the
Oh, rationality rules.
rationality rules. Yes. Yeah. So I was listening to them have a conversation. I don't know if you saw it or not.
Yeah, I did.
And there was a point where, you know, Pageau was talking about like heaven and earth and like these symbolic distinctions, like order and chaos. And the rationality rule guy was like, oh, so like femininity is chaos, femininity is bad. And then Pageau was like, wait a minute. I didn't say good or bad, right? That's not the distinction, right? It's like order or chaos. And I think in our culture, we're so prone to just see chaos as bad and only bad that
Mm-hmm.
that mind body dualism gets kind of mapped onto that. Does that make, you know what I mean? Because like
Yes.
body is associated with chaos, with earth, with concrete reality, and that tends to get like marginalized in a way that it shouldn't, because the distinction isn't good and bad. Like they're both necessary like components. You know, like you need a body to manifest the spiritual, right? And
Yes.
you need the spiritual to give meaning to the body, right? You know, and so you need
Yes.
both of those. Um, so I don't know. That's, I guess that's kind of, it's a somewhat nuanced take, but I would say there are some ways in which it's helpful, but that ultimately, like as you mature, so to speak, spiritually, I think that it has to be transcended at some level, and it's not, I don't think, helpful in a scientific sense, at least.
Right. Yeah, I feel like, I mean, Stoicism is another one that kind of had that dualism, which is helpful for self-discipline to some extent, but has, you know, its potential abuses in a similar sense of disdain for the body that like Nietzsche railed against, understandably, as kind of a counterbalancing, over tipping the opposite direction. And then I feel like mindfulness has some of the same benefits, but in a more paradoxical way where you kind of just go into the body. Do you feel like that's a more healthy solution for self-discipline?
Maybe. I think it depends on what you're doing with your mindfulness practice and whether or not you're doing like a variety of complementary practices rather
Yeah.
than just doing a single, like just straight Vipassana, right? Um, I'm not currently practicing mindfulness. I was for a long period of time. I've been meaning to get back into it for quite some time now, but I haven't really been able to get around to it. I think mainly because I've been learning how to be conscientious again. Maybe that's cool. I guess that's the first priority. Um, so eventually I hope to get back into it, but when I do, I hope to integrate like a set of different things, maybe loving kindness, some kind of contemplative practice, some kind of straight sort of mindfulness attentive practices, and then like focused concentration versus like kind of the scaling up, scaling down, zooming in, zooming out, that Vervaeke talks about.
Yeah, I found the scaling up and down be extremely helpful, and like I feel like the using Vervaeke's language, the primary difference between the hemispheres is the left is scaling down to features, and it's the having mode, and then the right hemisphere is scaling up to gestalts, and it's the being mode.
Yep.
That was quite helpful for me, and then I kind of developed my own little combination autodidactic daily practice of like standing outside generally after I've like jogged or something, and then like doing a minute or so of just what do you call it, where you're just focusing on auditory, with eyes closed, and then I'll do like 3 different objects of gratitude, which I feel like is connected to what he calls contemplation and metta to some extent. But then I'll do like the 3 different aspects of them using Forrest Landry's work of like the transcendent aspect, which is your own phenomenological, for example, image of something, and then the omniscient aspect where you imagine like the thing in itself, the noumenon, like what is it like to be that thing, and then the immanent where it's like the gestalt of both of those, and it's kind of the relation between you and the object of gratitude, which I found quite helpful, more so than the varieties of meditation I was doing, which I used to do like daily, and then I've been doing it more like weekly, and it's just, yeah, I feel like I have to do it daily for it to be helpful almost. I'm like barely, staying above water when I only do it weekly or something.
Hmm.
And then I'll do like affirmations after those 3 gratitude things, which I've, made more flexible over the years and months, which is nice for now. That's basically my little spiritual autodidactic practice. But recently I have been more interested in researching like Whitehead and process theology,
Yeah.
um, and its correlations with Buddhism.
Well, one thing that was interesting, so when that Vervaeke first put up his like Patreon page, he had this like thing that he came out with where like you could pay to like be like a pen pal with him. So I did that for like a month or two, and so like we exchanged a few emails back and forth, and I was kind of telling him a little bit about my own history, some of my own concerns, about this, not necessarily wanting to abandon religion, but at the same time not feeling like there's a suitable alternative and all this other stuff. And one of the things was interesting. He recommended a bunch of different stuff. He was like, you should really practice Neoplatonism. So he had like all this Neoplatonic stuff he sent me. But one of the things that surprised me was he sent me, well, he didn't send it to me, but he recommended it to me and I bought it. It's this book called Master Keys to Union. And it's like written from the perspective of this like monk in the Christian mystical tradition, and it's like, but it's like this guy like who's still around today, like not like a, and
Oh,
so it's written in like modern language, and it's basically like here are the steps in the meditation practice to practice like union with God, basically. And he was like, you should check
interesting.
this out. And I was so surprised to get that recommendation from like Vervaeke. Like I thought I might get that from like Jonathan Pageau or something. I was like, oh, all right, well there you go. I found it helpful. At some point, I think I had a period of time where I was doing like those sort of meditation practices somewhat regularly. And they're kind of like a variant of mindfulness, but they like want you to notice particular things. And so like the big thing is like, um, first become aware of your senses, the fact that you're sensing things, and then become aware of the awareness behind the senses. So like the awareness in which those senses sit, and it kind of like a awarenessception sort of thing, where like you just peel
Yeah,
back further and further and further, until everything is like, it's kind of the idea. And then that goneness is the state in which you attain union with God, so to speak.
interesting.
I never practiced it regularly enough that I think I got like the full benefits. I did get some like kind of trippy experiences from doing it, but never like on a regular basis. So I think at some point I eventually will go back and do that. But I also I like saved a playlist of all Vervaeke's like meditation videos. Um,
Mm-hmm.
meditation. I'm going to do them at some point. I just haven't gotten around to it.
Yeah, I did them for a while, not up to date where it was that day that I was following. I was always behind, but it was quite different from what I've done before, including his like kneeling stance and then the talked about washing. I think it was mostly what do you call it? The now all my years
Finding
of Buddhist research are bending me. The body awareness, huh?
the body, like I was like finding your root.
Oh, well, that too. Yeah, finding your center. That was kind of useful for my spine, which I always tend to go down over time.
Yeah,
Um,
I need to do it more often because
yeah,
I'm sitting behind computers all day.
yeah, yeah.
And it's
I
like,
always like to crouch, or I'll like squat on a chair when I'm on a computer because it's more, you know, evolutionarily what we used to do instead of sitting at that 90-degree angle. So I'd recommend trying that. I did that for work a long time.
interesting. So like just like a regular kind of like I got to get in better shape if I'm going to do that.
Yeah, it helps your flexibility, and you gotta let your ankles touch, which for a while I was not doing, and that's not as good. So,
Okay, there you go. So like
um,
squat and let your ankles touch in the chair.
yes, it
Try that.
doesn't have to be a chair, obviously. I mean, you'll see like toddlers do it like on the beach or something, just naturally. Like that's naturally how, you know, our ancestors would like squat around the fire in the campsite and so on without chairs.
Mhm.
And if someone can't do that, it's like it's a bad sign for their physicality, I feel like.
Yeah,
Um,
I might
with You might have to try that, or you might not be able to.
I'm not sure. I think I'd be able to, but I don't know for how long.
Yeah, try that out. Um,
I'm
what was I
definitely
gonna say?
not very flexible. The flexibility genes do not run in the family, so that's something to. I'll need some very intensive yoga to correct that problem.
Have you done yoga?
Just like here and there, I've done a few sessions with like friends or other people who were into it, but I've never done it as like a regular practice. I would say probably the only thing I've done like really regularly for a long period of time was like traditional like Vipassana. I probably did that like regularly for like 2 or 3 years. Back when I was first getting into Buddhism. It's funny because I'm now like, I read this Buddhist modernist book, by Evan Thompson,
Mm,
and uh, I was totally a Buddhist modernist, like just like 4 or 5 years
yeah,
ago. I was like,
same here.
all the like, yeah, neural Buddhism and like enlightenment and all this other stuff. And I was all about it. And then at some point I like, it just sort of fell apart for me. Like it just no longer, it lost a lot of its luster, I guess. Like I just started to
Mm,
see more and more cracks in the foundation of it. And I think a lot of it too was like, really having dialogues with people who are like actually Buddhist and realizing that like what I was doing was not like even close to like
hmm.
how Buddhism is typically practiced by most people in most contexts who are like actually Buddhist. And I was like, oh, okay. I'm doing something, but it's not like Buddhism exactly.
Yeah, and I definitely take that critique from mostly from Pageau in that Revivism interview seriously, where most religions, because they've evolved over such a long period of time, you would think in theory they have a, you know, they already have a kind of dynamic balance of practices that match well with each other, as opposed to trying out just a few and mixing them, which, you know, can be really good or not so good depending on what you do. But I feel like this is related to what I was going to say before about you said the modern Christian mystic. I was reading some stuff on Meister Eckhart recently, which had that similar um, what he called like getting beyond the idea of God to the experience itself, like the desert of the Godhead, where the
Yeah.
soul and God are one in silence and so on. And I feel like that level of mysticism was kind of seemingly lost as Christianity developed and like the Reformation and so on against the hierarchy, where then it almost seems like the most I don't know about the most intelligent people within Protestantism, perhaps, you know, the Enlightenment era, just if they didn't have that trajectory of like increasing knowledge, like the integral thing, like Ken Wilber and so on,
Mhm.
then they might just like split off and become an atheist or whatever. And so I feel like in Protestants especially, there's a kind of schizophrenia between the extreme left hemisphere and extreme right hemisphere, or like the space and time, where they're very literal in the interpretation. It's like all about the text, but then they also have like charismatic music and stuff where they're just supposed to like let loose and just have faith, like it, where it's totally irrational. You know, that split between like the Enlightenment rationality and the Romanticist
Hillsong Christianity.
subjectivity. Huh? Pasted onto Christianity?
I said Hillsong Christianity. It's like a
Hillsong?
it's like a Christian like band that's like super
Oh
popular.
yeah,
Like it's a
yeah.
Christian basically.
That sort of thing.
Like, okay, let's put on the best concert for Jesus, you know?
Yeah, I like went to a Christian school, and then they would talk about like being on fire, and like if you're not jumping to the music, then there's something wrong with you, and that like definitely turned me off. That was probably a major factor in my eventual distaste and so on. Um, but yeah, that kind of spiritual hierarchy of like complexity that Ken Wilber talks about, I feel like was perhaps why so many people left religion in the first place, because there was that flattening of just like the literal interpretation, because there was no spiritual authority to have the more complex insights of like a Meister Eckhart or something,
Mhm.
or like a David Bentley Hart, to help people understand who actually have greater, you know, propensity and curiosity for intellect and so on.
Yeah, well, and it's interesting, like, that was one thing that was touched upon in that conversation Pageau had with Rationality Rules. And, one of the points Pageau made, which I'm somewhat sympathetic to, is that it's okay if a lot of people in a tradition have very simple or literalist interpretations, so long as there is uh, a hierarchy, so to speak, of elites who have a more
Mm-hmm.
profound grasp of the spiritual meaning of these principles, right? The problem is when that seems to be absent largely,
Yeah.
or at least uh, doesn't seem to be playing much of a moderating role in terms of the
Yes.
discourse of everyday religious individuals. And like, my own example, I was raised in the Mormon Church, and the Mormon Church is a little unusual in uh, the case of most modern religions because it has a very, very strict hierarchy
Mm.
where there's leadership positions at every chain, all the way up from the very top of the church, where you have the prophets, and then all the way down to the very bottom, where you have like the bishops of like local wards. And then every person in the ward gets some kind of calling to do something for the church, right? And so, you know, pretty much historically speaking, Mormonism, I mean, it hasn't been around very long, right? Like 1830 was the
Mm-hmm.
year, Joseph Smith founded the religion, and it basically, it's very literalist in its conception of things. And there's a class of like Mormon intellectuals who are more kind of like the David Bentley Hart types who don't, treat the principles quite so literally. But the problem is that those people are always somewhat ostracized because the leadership of the church itself preaches the literalist version. It would be one thing if the leadership of the church did something in the middle that was like
Yeah.
compatible with symbolism and with literalism, but they go the full literalist route where you either have to interpret what they say uh, as like literally true, or you have to play a really tremendous game of mental gymnastics to find a way to configure it, so that it works symbolically.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. I feel like. Sorry. Go ahead.
no, I mean that was pretty much the end of that point. So it's, I guess that's the crux of the problem. Is it's like I'm fine with having a large amount of people in a tradition being literalists, but it there seems to be some disconnect where for a lot of traditions it's like there's just doesn't seem to either be that intellectual class that's like non-literalist, or they just seem to have no influence at all, like they
Yeah.
seem marginal, so to speak.
Yeah. Exactly. I totally agree. It almost seems like the ones who do start, you know, just being curious and like not Vervaeke doing Vervaeke's definition of faith is like believing things without evidence or whatever just might exit, and then it creates this positive feedback loop where everyone who remains just gets more and more literalist and less tolerant. And
That
yeah,
might
I
be
feel
a
like
good
that.
argument for staying in the tradition. That's something I've thought about too. It's like maybe that's like the reason we should
Right.
stay in our religious traditions, because actually, if we all leave and join Project Civium, then the fundamentalists will become even worse.
I know it's
Tough.
definitely a point. It's one point. Yeah, so I feel like that kind of authority, for sure, it should be like, respectful and compassionate toward the people. Like Pageau is always going on about his aunt, who's just apparently not that intelligent, which I find hilarious how he talks about her. But
She's like, I hope
because
the aunt isn't watching these videos.
I know,
She's like, I wonder
uh,
what the nephew's doing.
because if the authorities only cater to the literalist interpretation, then I feel like that's the kind of dogma that Vervaeke is very on point in criticizing as a danger, because I feel like that's the sort of thing that would lead to, or perhaps did lead to, like the Inquisition and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and even historically, people like Meister Eckhart were always in a little bit of danger. You know,
Yeah. Yeah.
lots of other
Which,
who have been executed.
yeah, it really makes me wonder, like, is that always the case for other mystics and other traditions? I mean, maybe to some extent. I feel like there's a whole branch of that kind of more experimental stuff in certain traditions, like Tantra and Buddhism. Like, I'm always looking, where is the equivalent of Tantra in, for example, Christianity, like a whole mystical path. I mean, maybe I'm not that familiar with Islam. Maybe Sufism is somewhat related to that. I know it's related to Zoroastrianism, but
Yeah.
one where you, instead of always seeing like, you have to control the body and so on, and it's not just the inversion festival for the common folk that Pageau talks about, like the carnivals where everything's upside down for one day, which I definitely do think you need, but rather the upside downness, like in Tantra, where you actually allow, like, because you've already had some kind of experience of, well, whatever the language they would use, satori or whatever, then you can simultaneously be in a state of emptiness while allowing like the passions to flow in a healthy context. But I feel like Christianity is always, officially at least, saying like you have to control those. Like there's no room for experimentation with the passions, except for like some of the mystics, somewhat. But even then they're more like ascetic and often branded as heretics after the fact, if not before.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's no mindful sex in the Christian tradition.
Right. Yes, that. I wasn't even thinking about that, but that's the perfect example.
Yeah. Yeah. I remember there was I can't remember where I saw this, but it really cracked me up. I think somebody was, it was like some sort of meditative group, and somebody was talking about like mindful masturbation or something. And everybody in the group was just like, go away.
uh,
It was pretty
I
funny.
mean, like within Tantra and within the framework that I do think is the case of transjectivity being like the fundamental locus of like all meaning, where it's not the subjectivity or the objectivity, and because there's some degree of both uniqueness in terms of individual temperament and context, I feel like, yeah, for me, even if there's like, a heuristic that would cover 99% of people in situations, that would be some, healthy transjective uh, uh, context for almost anything, um, which I feel like maybe for understandable reasons, most dogma just doesn't leave room for, because then people would, I don't know, just think they could do it all the time, or like they're the special ones or whatever.
Mm.
Yeah, I just feel like having a space for that kind of experimentation within a religion seems like a key element for a one that's, um yeah, like complex and rich enough, that's not just scaling based on popularity. Like, I'm drawing a lot from Alexander Bard here. I don't know if you're familiar with him, but he views Islam and Christianity as like the pop religions that went for quantity over quality instead of their origins in Zoroastrianism and Judaism, respectfully. um, and
Popular.
then lacked those aspects, for example. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. I need, sounds like I need to become familiar with Alexander Ward because I like everything I've heard so far. I think like there, how do I put this? I think it's, one thing that's been interesting in the discourse lately is people have made this point about like rationality and irrationality in connection to like conspiracy theories, especially like the QAnon stuff that has been grabbing people's attention lately. Um, and I think one point people have been making is that there's a element of religiosity in this that um, manifests in an unhealthy form when it isn't given proper expression in traditional religious hierarchies, so to speak. And people will use
Mm-hmm.
that as an argument for like, this is why we need to all like go back to church or something like that, or like we need to like reinvigorate our traditional religions. And I guess, one way to frame this conversation and the issues surrounding it is there a context in which that's possible, in which there's a space for that, um, outside of the traditional religions? Is there that third
Mm.
religion that's not a religion? Is that really possible? I think that's another way of framing it. Because I think, when I consider my own kind of like preferences in relationship to like what the culture needs, that's kind of a tension point for me, where it's like part of me really does strongly think it might be better to like return to Mormonism and to like moderate the tradition to the
Mm.
extent I'm capable of moderating it from within, or certainly at least being a space where people, providing a space within the tradition where people can be comfortable having dialogues about like these kinds of things, right? Where they might not feel comfortable bringing them up in Sunday school or something, you know. Um,
Mm-hmm.
I wonder about that. But in terms of my own like proclivities and temperament, I I think I'd much rather be out in the woods with Project Civium, you know. Um,
Hmm.
and
Yeah,
so,
me too.
there's this kind of interesting tension point. Part of me, I don't know. Uh, I think though you've given me a lot of food for thought for sure, and there's a lot more there. I mean, I feel like we could talk for a few more hours about this stuff.
Yeah, there was the heaven and earth thing I was really interested to discuss, but I can save that if you'd rather.
Well, what did you want to add about that? Um,
Um, Primarily, like it seems to me that the earth being feminine and the heaven being masculine is not not all intuitive in my view. Same with the potentiality being earth or matter, and the um, let's see, I don't even know if you'd call it actuality for the forms and for heaven, because I feel like actuality is always the joining of potentiality with um, yeah, it just never works in my head. I always view like the mental or the spiritual as like the potential forms that bind with potential matter, I guess, to form an actuality. And I feel like the masculine feminine dichotomy there, which is based also or associated with like the patriarchal culture as well, where heaven has authority over earth, but then weirdly earth is the power for heaven, which always also seemed off to me, because you'd think like power is more associated with the masculine, and then like the authority is like the woman needs something, and then so she like provides the impetus for the man to go out and get resources. So in that sense, she has like the authority, and also in the sense of like in traditional cultures, women being more um, valuable in terms of survival. Like men are more expendable in like warfare and so on, because if there's like 9 men and 1 woman, that's less likely to survive than a group of 9 women and 1 man, just in terms of like evolution of religion.
right.
um,
Stuff.
uh, and yet I feel like the heaven being male is based on the metaphor of like agriculture or horticulture, which is the beginning of civilization to some degree, where the seed is heaven, and then the soil is the feminine in the earth. And then Matthew even talked about how the traditional symbolism doesn't even understand that half of the genes come from the women, that she's just like the container and the nutrients while the baby is um, developing. And I wonder if other cultures view that similarly. I mean, there are matrilineal cultures, so I assume, yeah, that's why it's patrilineal. But isn't Judaism also matrilineal now?
I don't know enough about Judaism to answer that.
I thought it is, which is really weird because it seems like it would be the opposite of that.
Yeah,
Um,
that's kind of always been my stereotype, I guess. But I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong about that. But I definitely see where you're coming from. One thing that was interesting, I remember the first time I really thought about this critically. It was actually something McGilchrist said. Um, I think he was being interviewed on Rebel Wisdom, and they were asking him about Jordan Peterson, and he said, you know, Peterson has this thing where like order is masculine and chaos is feminine.
hmm,
I have no idea what that means. Like I don't understand that at all. And I think I I think I get the metaphor or the connection, but I think there are limitations in it. And some of which you just pointed out. One of the things that's always been weird to me is Earth being associated with potentiality, like, and water and chaos, right? And heaven
hmm.
being like, because when I think Earth, I think solidity, stability.
Yes, thank you. That's what I always think of. And
Yeah,
I
right?
associate that more with the masculine, like it's
But, like,
hard and structured.
if you ever see like Avatar: The Last Airbender, you know, like all the Earth people are very like structure rigid, like
Yes.
stable. You know, it's
Yes.
like wait a minute, like there's something off about.
I Yeah, I get the water one. I actually am more intuitively in agreement with like fluidity. I like to use fluidity instead of chaos because, like you said, everyone has a negative association with chaos
Yeah,
for the feminine.
I would almost replace water with like Earth and heaven with Earth. You know, at least in that symbolic structure. So I'd say like
Oh,
it's Earth and
yes.
water rather than heaven and Earth.
Yes, because the forms are like abstract, like they're, I mean, he says they're simple, but they're also like they are the structure. And then
Yeah,
the matter, the earth is like the potentiality. And if you go down with the science, like past quarks, where it's just like, um, what do you call it? The quantum uncertainty or whatever. I guess in that sense, matter is potentiality at the most basic level.
yeah.
But more intuitively with like the earth, it definitely seems like it's stable. It's like the more masculine one. Whereas just for me, there's like a space in my mind for like the divine feminine that's very strong, and I feel like Christianity doesn't have a place for that very much, at least for me. Like the Mary, the Mother of God, isn't quite doesn't quite do it, especially like Protestants, obviously. Um, and that association with the heavens as being like mysterious and more, well, yeah, like airy, like not structured, but like kind of a hope that I associate more with the feminine. And Pageau does acknowledge that the feminine is like mysterious, so that makes way more sense to me that the forms, the invisible things would be feminine, and then the structure of matter would be masculine.
Right. Yeah, no, I mean I also feel that way too. I mean it was a little bit of a tension point when I was reading religion creation. There is like a, you know, well, when you think of like when you think of heaven, you think like transcendent, invisible, far off, you know, the only thing that you might associate with masculinity in heaven for me is like the maybe just like the idea of like light, you know, or at
Mm.
least light and the connection to like knowledge, um, of a particular kind, you know, like, you know, men have this very like left hemispheric sort of like knowledge orientation, sort of, well, and it's a lot of it is like, you know, it's like men are fixers, right? You know, it's like, and women are less so fixers than men, right? Where it's like, I want you to listen to my feelings versus like, I want you to give me a solution to this problem I'm meant to do about, you know. And I kind of, I don't know, like those symbolic descriptions of heaven seem a little bit more feminine to me than they do masculine, at least in terms, but I don't know, maybe that's like part of it is it's like a collision of our current culture's sex stereotypes with like
Hmm.
older stereotypes that are not culturally available to us. So I mean, that could
Yeah,
be something like that.
yeah. Like I said, I think the metaphor was probably because like sowing seeds in the ground as agriculturalists. And maybe because we're not, like most people aren't farmers now, it doesn't work so well where the seed
Sure.
is the masculine heaven that informs earth. And obviously you tie that to reproduction and so on. And then also maybe the fact that you don't necessarily know for sure who your father is. Then it's like the heaven is the mysterious one. I can
Yeah.
see that, but I feel like there is the opposite as well, and that's very like it's very obvious to me. Also, like with Vervaeke's the study or the survey about the square and circle associations. Like the circle was like motherly and like gentle and much more feminine, and the square was more masculine and so on. And then if you look at the symbolism of most ancient cultures before Copernicus, the heavens were the circle because they're like perfect, and the earth was a square because there's like, you know, four directions and so on. And then you think of the domes of all the different, like both Islamic and Christian cathedrals are circular, and that's like the heavens, the firmament. And so if you take that phenomenologically with the cognitive scientists that Vervaeke did with the circle and square associations, it seems like for sure that the language of creation is talking about the wrong way around, to me at least, to some degree.
Seems like a bit of an inversion. I mean, to be fair, I mean, the language of creation is very straight, explicit about this interpretation being rooted in the culture of,
Yes.
of that time period. And so I don't know, but the thing is, like Vervaeke and or not Vervaeke, but both the Pageau brothers seem to still use that.
Yeah, that's the thing.
So,
Like
well,
it worked then well, it'll probably still mostly work, but I feel like there are some things we should keep in mind that perhaps like context is the one thing I always want to like emphasize to Jonathan. Like you have to remember context. And like do the patterns change? Do new patterns emerge? I always want to ask him these things, or is it just new manifestations, particularities of old forms, for example?
well, and I think part of the problem with assuming that it's new manifestations of old forms is that it assumes that ancient cultures were perfect in some sense, like in the sense that they were able to grasp all the relevant patterns and distill them into a symbolic
Mm-hmm.
text. And it's like, I don't know, that seems like a bit of a bold assumption to make to me, right?
Yeah, and I think like with Vervaeke's work, it shows that these things we understand first through like I think his four ways of knowing is one of his best contributions, his grammar in general, first through the participatory. So in the context of an agriculturalistic society or even a nomadic pastoralist one, it's still not the same as a hunter-gatherer one. I feel like the symbols and patterns that will emerge are based on their lifestyle. So it's a different lifestyle. Um, Maybe they had like a dim hint of these other patterns, or they attributed them to like foreign cultures, and like those are, you know, bad patterns because they didn't work for their lifestyle, which is fine, but we have a different one.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think this gets at another thing, which I think is very interesting. Something that I'm not sure. I tend to be a little bit more skeptical of when it comes to Pageau's work. Is there's this insistence that symbolism is discovered in some
Mm,
sense, and I would say much more kind of in the language of like 4E cognitive science. I would say much more that symbolism is enacted rather
mm.
than discovered. Um, which is to say that it like participates. It has a very transjective nature. Um,
Yes, yes.
it's symbolism is generated through a dynamic, kind of like a dance is generated, where it's like you don't discover a dance, you participate in a dance, and in participating, the dance is changed. But you aren't the sole originator of the dance, right? You need a
Right.
partner, um, and a context in which you and your partner can dance. You need a floor, a space in which you can dance, right? I think symbolism is like that, where um, it's open and flexible in a way that I think a lot of traditionalists are not acknowledging, or perhaps are maybe reluctant to acknowledge for fear
Yeah.
of opening the floodgates, so to speak. If you're
Yes.
thinking about it in that symbolic language, right, where it's like if you you know, because you open the floodgates into sort of like relativism, nihilism, you know, all that other stuff at the extreme end of things, where everything just becomes purely subjective. And the whole point of the transjectivity is it's sort of the middle way in a sense. It's that way out where it's like, no, 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 it's not just subjective, right? It's not just whatever
Yes.
like goes, but it's, it's a dynamic dance. And the reason you can tell that is like some dances are very pleasant to watch and some are very painful to watch. There are good dancers and bad dancers,
Yeah, and there
I,
could be also the danger. Oh, go ahead.
I like the analogy of music quite a bit for this example. Music's very important to me. I like to play music, but um, there are definite rules and principles by which um, you know sound that sounds harmonious and musical occurs. And if you violate those rules, you have sound instead of music. You just have noise, right? Um, and so the patterns have to be oriented in the right way. Um, but you can always create a new melody, you know.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess once again the question is whether it's just like a new melody is a new particular instantiation of an old pattern, but I feel like yeah, it's not like there's potential for new patterns to some extent. I mean, even if you look at the large time scale, I think for sure with evolution, um, and like there is the danger of trying to fit new patterns to like just what current cultural trends are, and they're not like sustainable. And I think, like you said with the dance, Pageau is always emphasizing that it's like, does it work for like a community? And then there's some need for like uniformity to some degree, and context seems often to get sacrificed for the coherence, which is understandable in like group versus group competition, cooperation for competition against other groups, and so on, evolutionarily. But I also like McGilchrist's emphasis on music as like indicative of the right hemisphere, and so I thought it was also interesting how time, the circular time, was associated with music, and how like instruments aren't allowed in like the holy of holies area because they're like the inversion or the flipping of things, like the day of jubilee. Um, yeah, I felt like the circular time versus the stable space, that felt more accurate for feminine and masculine to some degree, not so much the heaven and earth, for me.
Yeah. You touched on, I think, McGilchrist's emphasis on music in the context of music not being allowed in the Holy of Holies. I'm actually not as familiar with that.
I might not be using the exact language, but basically music was like, it was associated with like recreation. It wasn't associated with like, I mean, it's understandable. It's not technically like necessary for survival, right? And that's
Right.
what all the left stuff was. But then I think maybe it was a different video. It was talking about how instruments aren't allowed, like as you get closer to the, maybe it was the Holy of Holies, where people just use their voices because he connected it to the garments of skin thing, where instruments are divorced from like the body and the soul because they're a technology and so on.
Right. It's less you because you're adding something that like
Right.
is created. Yeah. Okay. I think that makes sense. Yeah.
But that doesn't necessarily apply to music in general, of course, because you can have vocal music.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think that was the confusion there. But yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, because if you're like singing or other things like acapella and whatnot. Um, have you had that? So that's now I'm just remembering something I was going to mention earlier. Have you ever seen the movie Arrival?
Yeah, I love it.
Such a good film, and I feel like it's so relevant to like the circular time completion. Like, oh my gosh, I feel like I need to like
Oh,
go through and watch that movie again and like with a like and do like a language of creation type analysis of that movie.
that would be good. Yeah, I would love to see that. I feel like it's such a realistic portrayal of what an actual alien encounter would occur in terms of how the humans would react as well.
Oh yeah,
Um, and
yeah,
the creativity for the aliens themselves. Yeah, it's a brilliant movie.
Well, what's interesting is it's a lot different. So it's actually based off a book. I don't know if you've read it. It's a short story, um, and
I
it's
haven't
interesting.
read it.
The movie is quite different in some important ways that are much that I think were a great choice for a movie, because it gives you a much better allegory of like the human interaction with the alien presence. Whereas the book doesn't really go much into that. Like there's no international conflict in the book whatsoever. Uh,
Oh.
it's really just focused on the way in which Louise's mind changes as she interacts with the heptapods and learns their language. The book is actually a little depressing because it like has a very hard determinist perspective
Mm.
where it's like once she learns the future, it's impossible for her to change it. You know,
Uh,
because it's like total like time. It's sort of like the block view of the universe where it's like time is all like pre-existent and that we're just running the clock, down to,
mm.
from beginning to the end
Mm.
of the universe, that kind of a thing. It's interesting. Like it gets way more into physics than the movie ever did. I personally prefer the movie, but it's still really the short story is still really thoughtful and interesting.
Um, I don't know if it's appropriate for an ending note, but what's your take on free will and determinism?
Well, yeah, it's a
Just
great way to end. Uh, you know, I guess I would say I'm somewhat of a compatibilist in this way, which is that I think that what people generally are talking about when they're talking about free will is something closer to volition than libertarian free will. And
mm.
by volition, really, I think what people generally tend to mean is that the actions are like sort of self-generated. Um, they're not compelled from the outside, um, and that there's some variability that seems to be a consequence of like internal mechanism, that's going on inside the person's nervous system and the dynamic integration. And I think like all of that, I think that's a meaningful construct and accurate. Descriptively in like in a prescriptive sense, it's functionally useful, in terms of um, like just having a functioning society. It's hard to
Hmm.
imagine what it would do to people to believe that they had no free will, like in a real sense, that everything they did was strictly determined. Um, that being said, like within the ontology of physics, it's definitely the case that you know every act, well, just cause and effect, right? Every effect has a wide variety of causes, right? And you don't cause those causes, right? And so you are consequence of causes that you did not cause, right? And that's sort of like the determinism argument, in a nutshell. And so I guess that's kind of my perspective. I'm compatibilist. I don't believe in free will in the libertarian sense. Um, in the determinist sense, like in a superficial way, I'm sort of like, yeah, everything is caused by previous causes. So, you know, you aren't exempt from that. And I guess in the compatibilist sense, I'm like, I still think volition is meaningful in that context. I don't know. Those are my thoughts. What about you?
What do you what do you think about the like the quarks being to some degree unpredictable, and especially if you combine it with like
Uh-huh.
the panpsychist view that they have some kind of tiny degree of freedom that scales up.
I'm somewhat open to it. I'm not sure how it would preserve free will. It certainly wouldn't preserve for libertarian free will
Oh
because
yeah, I don't think libertarian free will. It's a terrible concept.
yeah, it's yeah
It
that
makes little sense.
yeah, it doesn't really, it's not really coherent. Like I'm open to it hypothetically. I don't find it super plausible, and for a lot of reasons. But I'm certainly open to it. Heck, I'm open to the
Hmm.
possibility that we have immortal souls that go on after we die. I don't find it plausible, but I'm open to it.
Right. Yeah, I wrote an article on like the crux of plausibility as like the key thing where John talks about the elegance versus the convergence of evidence on the other side, which is like the stability. And in fact, for example, conspiracy theories are like epistemic junk food, where they're like all elegance and then very, what do you call it, confirmation bias selected convergence. Yeah,
Yeah, you
but
definitely admire the creativity, um, you know, of a
oh
determined.
well, I guess the crowdsourced creativity of
I
QAnon.
suppose, I suppose.
Um, my personal conclusion, or not conclusion, but what helped me was thinking in terms of free will was that it really depends on where you locate the self, like
Mm,
scaling up and scaling down, especially like if you scale down just all the way to consciousness or awareness, like in the pure consciousness event, then then it would seem phenomenologically like it's deterministic, except for that one little dot, I guess. But like where you direct it, maybe. I haven't got to that point in meditation, so maybe you can't direct it. Whereas if you scale up to like all your different what do they call them, like the different mental modules, which are often represented mythologically as like the different emotions or gods or whatever, and and your body and so on, and you identify, and then you identify with things even beyond your body, then it's more like you have more will in some sense, like it's a gradient in terms of what you identify with in addition to what you actually do have influence over, which is relational still, but yeah.
yeah, I think that's helpful. For a long time, I had the Buddhist view of like no self, right? And so for me, the free will determinism thing was sort of meaningless because it was like, well, there's no self to be determined or free,
Mm,
um, because there's no self to begin with. I don't think I'm not really there at that place anymore. I would say I'm more like sided with the enactivists, like in the cognitive science tradition, where they would say the self is sort of like a dynamic construction, like a dance is a dynamic construction,
mm-hmm. Yeah.
and and so to the extent that freedom is a thing, I would say it's a dynamic construction. And I do think there's a meaningful sense in which there are degrees of freedom, right? Where
Yes.
people can be more or less free given certain conditions and certain contexts. And I think there is a meaningful sense in which if you train yourself in a contemplative or a meditative tradition, you can access certain freedoms, so to speak, that others may not be able to access as a consequence of your training. Sort of like
Yeah.
inner mental freedoms. Um, well, just that, like, even like the basic thing in mindfulness where you train a pause between the impulse to act just to notice the impulse. So there's a gap between
Yeah.
the impulse and the action. Like that right there, if you can do that regularly, that's a tremendous source of freedom because you don't
Yeah.
you're compelled to act the moment you have an impulse, right? And everybody sort of has to do this to some degree to like function normally. Yeah, I definitely think like that helps, like thinking about how you identify like what a you is, and like which parts of the self you find most salient in terms of your like selfhood, your identity, so to speak. Um, you know,
Mm-hmm.
it's a great topic, and there's so much more to discuss. I think we should chat another time, and when we do, we should talk about the Greg Henriquez stuff. I think his stuff
Oh
is
yeah, sure.
fascinating, and consciousness too in general. I think Um, I don't know if you've seen this or not. This is like a more recent thing. I think Vervaeke gave a talk recently on matter and consciousness.
Hmm.
It's really neat
I
hearing him elaborate his views. I can like text you a link to it or just like message it to you, I guess. Um,
Sure.
it's a long one. I think it's like two hours or something like that. But
Oh wow.
he kind of talks about like the mind body problem and a bunch of other things in great detail. He has this really interesting idea of like uh, I think matter sort of being almost a sense like sort of like a I'm going to struggle to put this in the right words. I think the way he would frame it is that matter provides the resistance for consciousness to manifest itself, or something like that.
Oh, interesting.
Um, he has this whole thing with this resistance, polarity, distinction, stuff like that. He gets into it. It's really interesting. Um, but I think you'd like it. It would be something interesting to talk about, whenever you get a chance to check it out.
Yeah, definitely. The language almost sounds like the object-oriented ontology stuff Jared was mentioning.
Yeah,
Um,
that's another thing I need to explore too, because I've been hearing like snippets about this stuff, and it sounds interesting, but I haven't had any chance to read any of the primary sources.
yeah, I just got one book on it, and then object-oriented theology. I'm looking forward to reading those. But yeah, I'll definitely check out that video. He's talking with someone else then, right?
It's like a presentation, like
Oh, really? Interesting. He hasn't done this for a while.
yeah, it's like a Skype presentation at like some sort of conference thing. So there was like a series of
Hmm.
talks, and it's like one of his.
And then I'll definitely finish the series on consciousness, the hard problem that he did with Greg before we talk again as well. That'll be good.
Yeah, that would be great. I think it'd be really interesting to explore some of those topics more. You give me a lot to think about for sure. Um, whether or not it will resolve my spiritual homelessness is another question, but that's an ambitious task. But I appreciate it.
Wish you uh, good. I always hate using good luck or good fortune, but yeah, like good trajectories in that arena. And thanks for the book recommendations also. Are you gonna join Jared's next group, assuming he does similar books soon?
Yeah, definitely. So
Awesome.
we'll see each other around for sure.
Do you have a preference among the books that he listed?
Man, there's so many. I don't even know.
I
I
know it was huge.
I'd like have to like look at the list again. I would like to do a little bit. Honestly, think it'd be interesting to do something like a little out of left field. There were some like books about like African theology, which looked interesting to
Hmm.
me. Some like stuff about like architecture and symbolism in like Islam.
Hmm.
Um, those are all interesting. I mean, they're definitely not like high on my current priority list. It's funny. I actually have a hold on one second. I have like a reading list um, in Excel, which is like the dorkiest thing ever. Um, but
Oh, I
it's
should
more
put mine in Excel.
it's I know it's like such a grad school thing, but it's like sorted by the authors and sort of the priority. There's one that I really think would be interesting to do. Um, well, I'd love to do process and reality, um, but
It might help force everyone through it. I was planning to read it on my own, like I said, but it just the fact that John Vervaeke couldn't finish it was like, whoa, what the heck?
I know, I know. I remember he recommended like Nishitani, and I was like, oh, okay, cool, let's check it out. And I started checking Nishitani out, and I was like, oh man, all right, I'm in for it. And
Yeah.
there's another one that looks really interesting to me, both The Dynamics of Faith by Paul Tillich and The Weakness of God, The Theology of the Event by John Caputo. Those were two things that were recommended. Both of those look interesting. I know John Caputo wrote a lot of really interesting stuff about hermeneutics, which I think is a really interesting topic. Um, so I don't know. That's something else. Christian, like, and I in our reading groups, like we talk about hermeneutics like all the time.
Hmm.
We became really good friends before like these reading groups, but like I introduced him to Jared and he kind of joined these groups. But like, yeah, it's fun. Him and I we just when we get together, we just go completely crazy and we just talk about all sorts of insane things.
That's awesome.
So,
Yeah, I just finished the book that was on Meister Eckhart was by John Caputo comparing he and Heidegger, like the mystical element in Heidegger that was based on that German tradition. And then I love the one book I did read by Paul Tillich I love. So yeah, I'd
yeah,
definitely be up for either of those as well.
yeah. I'm reading a book called Heidegger and Cognitive Science right now. That's like the next one on
Ah,
my
nice.
reading list. So there you go.
Yeah, I feel like he's the big thing now, and maybe for this, Caputo thought he was like the going to be remembered as the greatest philosopher of the 20th century. So maybe now he's like catching up.
We'll see. But thanks again. This was super fun.
Yeah, you as well. All right, have a good night.